Greetings, you curiouser and curiouser Herle Burly-ites. We have a great show teed up for you today. It's not an American topic because it's broader than that, which we'll get to in a minute. But if you watched Trump's inauguration, you couldn't help but notice all the tech bro billionaires seated on the dais in their places of honor, flanking the incoming president. Musk, Zuckerberg, Bezos, Cook, etc. So I want to have a conversation about this growing influence of big tech and business on our government, our politics, our society, and how they view journalism and media today. I couldn't have a better guest to do that with. David Skok joins me today. David is the founder, CEO, and editor-in-chief of the very excellent The Logic, Canada's Business and Tech Newsroom. Prior to that, he was the associate editor and head of editorial strategy at the Toronto Star, and the managing editor and vice president of digital for the Boston Globe. And there is a Canadian context for all this. Toby Lutke, founder of Shopify, is part of a group of tech entrepreneurs who've just launched a new platform called Build Canada, an effort to influence government policy on issues like immigration, healthcare, and so on. David, you and your team have been all over this story and the broader topic. I can't wait to get into it with you. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's start off with telling my listeners a little bit about the very excellent Logic. What is it? Where do they find it?
Thank you. The Logic is a business and technology publication. It's a news organization that was founded in 2018 after my various stints that you just went through at different organizations. We wanted a publication that really was able to tap into the moment that Canada was in, which some of which I assume we'll talk about today. Technology itself had been siloed, generally speaking, to the business section of a newspaper for Apple launches or Steve Jobs going on stage, and we were at a moment where technology is everything and it impacts every part of our lives. And so we started out as a technology publication, really with the idea being that we would cover the business of technology. I'll share a little bit more about that because I think it's relevant to the conversation we're about to have. We realized very early on that we couldn't cover technology without covering Ottawa and policy. Because the largest venture capitalist in the country is BDC, for example. So very quickly we realized, okay, well, we're a technology and policy shop. And then we realized, well, you can't cover tech and policy without economics. So we added economics, and then you can't cover all of this without business and finance. So we're now a national newsroom with 5 bureaus across the country, a team of 30 people, and most recently received and secured a funding round from the Financial Times out of London last summer, which has really taken us into a different orbit, I think, as a news organization.
What were you doing at the Toronto Star? I've been reading that paper all my life, and I didn't even realize it had a business section.
I was not a business journalist. Actually, I was the digital, quote unquote, the digital guy who came in to help transform the work that I had done at the Boston Globe. Was helping them move from an advertiser-driven website. You'll remember Boston.com, or if you're a sports fan, you've probably read that a lot. We migrated that to BostonGlobe.com and turned it into a sustainable, now profitable news organization with over 200,000 subscribers. So coming back to Canada, which, after a while, when you live in the US, you as a Canadian, you feel the pull home, and maybe that's more relevant now than feeling that a bit more than I have in the past few years in this moment. Felt like there was more that we could do here.
That's interesting. What was that pull home?
So I had a great editor at the Globe, a guy named Brian McGrory, and he was from Boston. He had been a newspaper delivery boy for the Globe, and I would sit next to him in our pitch meeting. So newspapers, as you know, you sit around and everybody doesn't, what was an A1 front page pitch meeting, now it's more 24/7. But we'd sit around and do this pitch meeting. And Brian would have this incredible innate ability to know about every person in Boston, every nook and cranny. And he would subtly, when a story was pitched to him from the Metro desk or the sports editor, he would text them, or you could see him texting someone he knew to get the real story, and subtly would plant that to the reporter. And Boston was a beautiful place to live. Our son was born there. I was engaged there, went to school there, but it wasn't home. And I was in some ways very jealous and envious of Brian knowing so much about the community that he lived in. So the pull home for me was to do the same kind of work, the impactful work, but to do it in the place that I care about the most, and with all the relationships I have, and the nooks and crannies of Canada.
Right. Let me ask you one last question about the logic. I read it every day. It is the first business thing I read in the day, but I don't subscribe to it. I access it through Apple News.
Yeah.
How does that work? Does that work for you as a company?
It works in terms of you knowing who we are. We're trying to build a 150-year-old news brand, and half of the challenge for us, not being a legacy news brand, is getting more people to know we exist. So right. Apple News is a great place for us. We don't put all of our journalism there. We put a selection of it there. But it's a great place for us to get the discoverability that we want. I would say from a revenue perspective, it's an inconsequential amount to our bottom line, but it helps from a marketing perspective, and we're constantly analyzing those relationships. And not to go too far down a rabbit hole, but when the world of AI and LLM scraping, you have to be very intentional about who you're syndicating your journalism to make sure that you can still retain the copyright and intellectual property associated with it. So it's an ongoing conversation. We also syndicate to Bloomberg terminals, for example. Ideally, you buy direct and you come to us and you have the experience and go to the events and all the other offerings that we have. But we're still trying to build our brand, so it helps.
But from your perspective as a business, you want me to subscribe directly to you.
Yeah, that's the ultimate revenue stream. It's recurring revenue. It's the most important loyal type of readership. It allows us to forecast and grow our business. So if you're out there listening and you haven't subscribed, we've got a sale offer now. Try it out. But yes, direct through us is always the best. And it would be for any news organization. These third parties are good for amplification. They're good for awareness. But we don't control the revenue. We don't control the algorithms. So it's always good to have it come direct instead.
Okay, so is it kind of like Spotify or something? Like in the sense that I feel now you're making me feel like I consume all this information and the money I pay goes somewhere, but in the case of music, not to the artists, and in the case of business news, not to you. How does this work?
You're absolutely right. It's when you look at the revenue models, who's the person who's being able to capture the revenue at the end of the chain? First, it's Spotify. In the case of artists, in our case, yeah, it's Apple, it's Google, it's Meta, it's now soon to be Perplexity and ChatGPT and others. This is why you've seen this rigorous debate around journalism and journalism policy, and the newspapers, lobby groups advocating heavily for their share, because at the end of the day, the creator of the journalism is not the one who's capturing the most revenue.
Right. Okay, well, thanks for that.
I can talk about that all day.
Count me down. By the end of the day, I will be a subscriber of The Logic.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Because I also buy directly from artists that I support, that I want to support as well. So, having spent months and months putting the focus on better customer outcomes in wireline internet, I give you a shift to how we can affect better health outcomes. So let me take you listeners to the not too distant past, when our entire health history and medical records were in our own heads or on scraps of disjointed notes, and maybe in the files of one provider. Remember how it was kind of a crapshoot to accurately communicate what might be critical information to other doctors or care providers. Have you ever taken such and such medication? Maybe. I think I have. What was the dosage? I don't remember. Well, our presenting sponsor, TELUS Health, has had a massive impact here in Canada and around the world on diagnosing and curing that problem. Proudly Canadian, TELUS Health operates in 167 countries and counting. They've grown to be a leader in health data interoperability, and today they provide electronic medical records to more than 36,000 clinicians. Their recent collaboration with Nova Scotia Health to enable residents access to their medical information is a pretty great case study in the benefits. It's one of the first large-scale efforts in Canada to standardize and connect primary care data, giving people the power to better manage their health and improve their outcomes. In practical terms, It means patients have seamless and secure access to their own health information. I would say any tool that helps us convey information to keep ourselves in good health is always welcome. But sometimes, as we know, situations become acute, and the need to communicate medical history instantly, accurately, efficiently with clinicians and care providers becomes even more critical. And this is just scratching the surface of how TELUS Health can help. Stay tuned. Tell me what Build Canada is.
Build Canada, we had a terrific report from Catherine McIntyre, who's been with us for many years, and Murad Hamadi and Laura Osman, who just joined us as well out of Ottawa. They had a great story a couple of weeks ago talking about what began as a WhatsApp chat group among 80 or so of the most influential, most important, most wealthy tech people in the country. That included where you are, or in Ottawa, Toby Lutke, Kaz Najatian, Dan DeBow, people who came from Shopify. It included people like Mike Ketchen out of Wealthsimple, but really people who were looking at the state of the country in their eyes and not seeing it in a place where they can compete on the world stage. And so they started through this WhatsApp group, built out the idea of having a platform where they can voice their concerns, write policy papers, share them with politicians, and try to provide what they see as a healthy addition to the discourse.
What were they trying to correct for? What's wrong?
Well, they would argue that it's been 10 years of, you've had Kevin Carmichael on the show, so, not the first to say it, and Trevor Tombe and others, but 10 years of productivity, product declining, regulatory barriers and hurdles to creating and building businesses, a tax structure that doesn't favor those who take risks or private enterprise. That's just some of the litany of things. But as you go through the list of who's on there and what they've written so far, you can read things about interprovincial trade barriers. You can read things about how AI could help government. They really see it as being, as I said at the beginning of this, about tech not just being a siloed thing, but that you can use tech to improve a lot of different areas.
All those indicators or metrics that you just referenced there are all relative, right?
Yeah.
So what's their benchmark? The United States?
It's a great question. It's one better asked of them, I would say. I think one of the things that you hear from them, and certainly comes through in the reporting, is it's getting harder and harder to scale a business in this country. And you know what? I will say, David, I'm a startup founder as well. Yes, I work for what seemingly could be seen as mainstream media, but it is a tough country. There is a gravitational pull towards incumbency and towards the status quo. And that's been around long before Trump announced tariffs. It's inherent in who we are as a people. If you go back, to some of the psychology around the founding of Canada, their argument, and it's one that I think resonates, is that it's really tough to build an institution in this country. There's been a bunch of things that have happened over the last decade that I'm not sure where I think there's contention is. I'm not sure that can all be blamed on a party or a government or policies. 10 years ago, the idea that you could raise capital outside of the country and bring it into Canada was very new. And in that time, in the heydays of low interest rates, you had foreign investment in this country, in its firms, in its venture capital, at record levels. Georgian Ventures, for example, was one that was able to attract foreign pension funds to come and invest in Canadian tech. You also had the idea that, Canada used to be a very small market. It's 1/10 the size of the US. But you could break through Canada. You could have a global market. Look at Shopify, the classic example, or BlackBerry, or Nortel before it. That this idea that, to succeed on the world stage, you have to be on the world stage. And there was that opportunity, they feel, I think. And a lot of that, and then you also had big tech. And big tech at that point was seen as a benevolent force. It wasn't seen as something that would overtake the country and block it. And so I think when I try to look at this from the perspective of the founders, over the last 10 years, that capital has disappeared, right? And for various reasons. It's been a lot harder to raise money in this country. It's been a lot harder to raise money globally, but in this country too. Big tech is no longer benevolent. It has taken a very heavy gravitational force in this country. Just look at some of what's happening with Amazon in Quebec as an example of that, around labor. And so for these founders, I think there's this frustration that we missed the moment, and that how do we get it back? And how do we get it back by, some of the rhetorical flourish that they use are, we just need to be bold. We need to be brave. We need to take risks. I think it's more than that. I think there are some of the regulatory pieces that we talk about, and there's a psychology thing that we talk about. But at least from what they tell me and what they've told our journalists, they're frustrated. They're frustrated that this feeling that the last 10 years have been squandered.
Okay. Is it purely economic, or is there a discernible worldview from the tech community on these kinds of things? I mean, if they just want to make more money, I get that. But if they have a different idea of Canada, I'm also interested in that.
Yeah. And I should say, I mean, there's not one monolithic view, to be clear. I think if you were to look at the spectrum, even if you go to the Build Canada list, I imagine, some of them are very supportive of Doge and would want to do a Doge in Canada, or supportive of Trump. But there's a whole other spectrum who, want Canadian solutions and are thinking pragmatically. So, I'd be careful about painting them all with the same brush. However, founders are interesting. It's an interesting psychology, and I've learned this as I've become an entrepreneur myself. You roll up your sleeves and you think that you can solve any problem. Paul Graham, last year, Y Combinator CEO, wrote a blog about founder mode, and how, the individualism of a founder is you go in and you do it. And the idea of industrial policy or industrial labor, where it's a team and you collaborate, and the days of GE and Pete Drucker and like selling the idea of a team, is the antithesis of what it takes to build a company as a founder or an entrepreneur, where it's all about rolling up your sleeves and doing it yourself. And so I think the worldview of these founders is one that, stop with the excuses. We can do this. It shouldn't be this complicated. I'm not saying I agree with it, but I certainly understand that that's the mentality is, why can't we just roll up our sleeves and get this done ourselves?
Okay, so, 10 years is a period of time, but it's also has a political connotation. And it seems like there is an implicit, if not explicit, criticism of the policies that have been pursued by the Trudeau government. Are there specifics about that? What would they point to in terms of government policy that has created or exacerbated this problem?
Yeah, in some of the reporting, a lot of these same people were invited to be on economic roundtables back in the early days of the Trudeau government. You remember Dominic Barton was in charge of these growth tables, and a lot of these venture capitalists and tech people were invited to Ottawa, sat on these panels, and really felt like they were getting involved in order to shape policy. I think what they discovered is what we all kind of discover, and that government's messy and government's hard. I've sat on panels for government, and I'm still waiting for some of those reports to come out. It is a hard thing to reflectively see output on, right? And so I think there was a frustration with that, but also some of the policies that were taken. Superclusters is one example that often is cited. Superclusters was supposed to be don't spread the peanut butter thin. Pick winners. Let's pick, Navdeep Bains at the time, the innovation minister, was talking about, let's create 10 Shopifys. Pick your winners and invest in the winners. And I think what you ended up seeing was, instead of picking one winner, well, they spread it out a little bit. There were 4 superclusters in 4 different regions of the country, giving out money to a lot of different interests. And that wasn't what a lot of these people had envisioned. I think this built up, right? It didn't happen overnight. There was that. The ultimate moment when it seems to me the floodgates opened was the capital gains tax last year. That was the moment when it became an attack on me, right? Like, it wasn't just policy. You were coming after me, and you were saying to the country, according to them, that we don't matter, that our success is not your success. And we need to lift up everybody else at the expense of your success. That's really the moment when I think a lot of these people who had been somewhat underground in their criticisms and complaints shifted allegiances, started donating to the conservatives, started meeting with the conservatives. I think that moment, the capital gains tax was about so much more than just policy to them. I think it was an attack on their very being and way of life in this country.
Well, if I was arguing it back, David, I would say if I was a tradesperson or a nurse, I would say, A, your success doesn't have anything to do with my success. And second of all, we already tax your incomes at a far lower rate than you tax my income. What do you want?
Fair enough. It's not my job to, defend their arguments about why it was what it was. I think they would argue, though, that, the idea is we contribute to the tax base. I'll use the logic as an example, David. We started with 3 people in 2018. We now have a team of 30 people. One of the great rewards as a founder for me, as an entrepreneur, one of the most rewarding parts is, number one, it's not the output, it's not the journalism, although that's wonderful. It's watching the people that have come with me on this journey start families, buy houses, be able to afford life, and in and of themselves contribute to the tax base. And I'm just small. We're a small business. We have 30 people. I can only imagine what that must feel like for an entrepreneur that is employing thousands of Canadians every day and saying, you know what? Yeah, sure, it's about me and what I've brought to the country, but it's also about what I've contributed to the tax base and what I've created from a productivity per capita standpoint. You have a different vantage point on this when you are the builder yourself, right or wrong. You see it from a different perspective.
Right. Yeah. Well, that makes sense. And I've been a small business person myself, and took some pride in that. But I didn't necessarily feel like I deserve to pay lower taxes than other people. And when we're talking about the capital gains exemption, we're just talking about the part which you don't have to pay any tax at all. Even the capital gains tax is lower than an income tax.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I would add that there's maybe a broader, how would say this? I think you can have very different visions of Canada. Right now, everybody is waving the flag and very supportive of Canada.
Yeah.
There's a fundamental question at the heart of Canada that I think we've been wrestling with for centuries. Do we measure our success in foreign direct investment in this country? In having the Googles of the world and the GMs of the world come and build factories here? That's one way to measure Canada's success. Or do we measure our success by how we are able to survive and create as a sovereign nation and stand up for our own intellectual property and our own 2 feet? And I think what's really interesting about this moment, or has been interesting over the last 10 years, has been that tension, and capital gains is part of that to me. It's one side of the coin of saying we can do this ourselves. Let's create the tax structure and incentive to do it. I feel like that tension is the question of Canadian ambition, and whatever side you come on, politically, partisan-wise, explains a lot of how you feel about these issues.
Well, I think that's really where I wanted to go, David. Thanks for unlocking that, because when I asked you what the worldview is or what they're comparing us to, I mean, these are truisms and banalities, but, Canada has never seen itself as equal to the United States, and Canadians, I think, have always known that the United States placed a higher premium on excellence and rewarding grand success, and that Canada was a kinder, gentler place that was a little bit more interested in equity, a little bit more interested in other aspects of standard of living than just maximizing economic output. And when the head of Shopify got into some public trouble in his intervention about the Trump tariffs, I think people sense maybe he doesn't agree with us about the country. Maybe he has American envy. Maybe he really wants Canada to be America.
Maybe. I wish he would tell me. We've had, one of the things about this community, both in Canada and the U.S., is there's a lot of tweeting, a lot of projecting. There's not a lot of conversation, and I would just put that out there as an editor, publisher. I would love to ask those questions. When you do it in a pithy tweet, it's kind of hard to interpret what you mean.
Right.
It is a fascinating question about what is Canada and what does it mean to be Canadian. And I think when you look at the last decade or even longer, when the markets opened up for a lot of these founders and a lot of these venture capitalists, the market opportunity was global. And I do wonder how much of this reaction is less about policy and more just about that structural shift in a world that is becoming less global and more protectionist, including in the United States.
Right.
I would also say just, on Trump, say what you want about Trump. One of the reasons I think he's managed to be successful as a communicator, which is your world, not mine, but there is generally a grain of truth to a lot of what he says. See if you're disagreeing with me there or not. I don't know, but
it depends.
Yeah. I would say, his arguments about Canada, getting to live upstairs and, not perhaps contributing what it needs to contribute to protect the continent, not putting its forward. We have been sleeping next to a giant that has let us live comfortably. And on this issue, I don't think he's wrong. I think there's a part of being Canadian that has had this great privilege of being just geographically next to the U.S., who has always treated us as a friend. So coming back to the tech community, I think what's interesting about what Toby is arguing is there is an opportunity here for Canada to sort itself out and to figure out how to live independent of that neighbor. Now, you can't realistically do that. It's not realistically possible. They're giant, but you're starting to see those conversations about building pipelines across the country in ways that we haven't seen in a long time, about interprovincial trade barriers disappearing. Those conversations haven't happened in a nationalistic way for as long as I can remember. So I don't know. I in that sense, I think there is a moment, and I think some of these tech leaders are trying to seize on that moment too.
I think you're describing the moment a half an hour ago. I mean, everything changes so fast.
Yeah.
I mean, listen, sure, there's a grain of truth in all that, or maybe even more than a grain in that. But if all this was about, and if Canadians believed that all this was about was us pulling our weight in defense, we would solve that tomorrow.
Yep.
Right? If that was all it took to restore the relationship, we would correct that tomorrow and we would acknowledge that we've been freeloaders and we would blah, blah, blah. But everybody knows it's about more than that. Right? Yeah. It's about much more than that. And so when you weigh in and you say, well, really what we should be doing is not fighting the United States, but trying to accommodate them and get along with them, you're talking about accommodating at a very fundamental level, like maybe joining.
Yep.
Right?
I should point out just clearly, I'm not saying I'm not trying to defend Toby. I'm not Toby. I'm a proud Canadian.
No, you're in a bad spot here. You're representing all these people
which I shouldn't be, because I'm ultimately just a journalist. But I will say this, David. For years, I have felt that our business community has not spoken up enough. They have not been public enough And whether I agree with a word that Toby Lutke says is beside the point. I actually appreciate that he's speaking up. And I appreciate that all of these business leaders are stepping up in this moment and having a voice. I wish, as I said, that they would actually have a conversation and not just a megaphone and talk to us about it. But at the end of the day, I think we need to hear from business leaders, whether they are. Galen Weston was at our big summit last year, and it was so refreshing to hear from him what he actually had to say, and instead of hiding. And I think whether it's Toby Lutke, whether it's Galen Weston, whoever it is, I think I'm leery about jumping down their throats and saying you shouldn't have said that, because I value the fact that in our civil society, they have a voice like anybody else. They have an opinion like everybody else, and we should hear it more. And I'm a champion of hearing it more, I guess.
Right. Okay, so we may be in a trade war, or we may not. Blanket tariffs may yet be imposed on Canadian exports, or they may not. Or maybe this is all just the opening round of a larger negotiation. Forgotten in the heat of the past couple of weeks is the fact that Canada is part of a trade treaty with the United States. Canadians call it CUSMA. Canadians call it CUSMA, the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement. It is the rules-based order for trillions of dollars of continental trade, and it is a very big deal. Our sponsor, CN, has been crucial in enabling it, linking suppliers and customers from coast to southern coast. After he signed the treaty, President Trump called it, quote, the fairest, most balanced, and beneficial trade agreement we have ever signed into law, end quote. That was 5 years ago. The agreement is up for review next year, and from the looks of it, the U.S. wants some changes. Fair enough. But CN, with respect, would like to cite a few passages from the White House's own website. On the site, you can look it up, it's right there. The Office of the President calls the free trade agreement, quote, a mutually beneficial win for North American workers, farmers, ranchers, and businesses. It talks about having created, quote, more balanced, reciprocal trade supporting high-paying jobs for Americans and grow the North American economy. The site goes on to provide a dense slurry of statistics in support of free, untariffed trade. And CN agrees wholeheartedly. The railway, like most other American and Canadian businesses, has shaped its operations based on the agreement and its predecessors, going right back to January 1st, 1989. It has been steady, beneficial progress. Win, win, win. By all means, let's review the treaty and renew it. I referred to on social media a paradigm that Stephen Harper had articulated a while ago called somewheres and anywheres. And somewheres are people that are rooted in their community or their country and are attached to that, and that's what they value about life. And anywheres are people that are currently parked in Toronto but could do their business in New York or Los Angeles or Amsterdam.
Yeah.
And they're less attached to their community and what it represents, and frankly more mercenary about that, right? So, to what extent are these people that are part of Build Canada, in your sense, are they anywheres or somewheres?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer. I assume there's a spectrum of people who. I mean, look, I'll say this: some of these people have made enough money in their lives successfully that they could pack up and live anywhere they wanted, and they live here. Not all of them do, by the way. Some of them live 6 months out of the year here and 6 months in Barbados. But the fact that they choose to be here, the fact that they care, I would take that as a positive. And I imagine if whether I'm Pierre Poilievre or Mark Carney or Chrystia Freeland, I would want to cultivate those relationships and make sure that they are engaged. Because coming back to it, I would rather that corporate Canada in any form, whether it's tech or Bay Street or energy, that they speak up that they actually join the conversation and not just sit in the sidelines. I think that's one of the things that you hear in the frustration is, oh, it's all lobbyists and everybody in backroom deals makes decisions, and it's hard to be a startup disrupting the face because you're competing against this gravitational pull. Look at, for example, open banking, and whether you like or don't like open banking, it's dragged for years. I think having these people actually speak up publicly, disclose their own interests, start the conversations, I think it's good for the country.
So I agree. I completely agree. And I think business, very important point of view. But I want to hear from business on more than just business. I want to hear from business on more than just what I need to support in order to make them more successful. And I'll tell you why. Because I'm a pollster. And I'll tell you that the relationship is broken. I've known for years, for example, that people didn't care whether the GDP was up or down because it didn't matter to their life or their standard of living. And now I can tell you that a small minority of people in Canada agree with the proposition: when big business is successful, I will be more successful. And when big business is successful, Canada will be more successful. Most Canadians reject that relationship. Why is that?
And it's not just business, it's media, it's government. I mean, you see it with the Edelman Trust Barometer every year, it just continues to go down. I think it's because they don't tell their story well enough. I don't think they articulate how they impact the rest of the country. I would say this is to the credit of Build Canada. If you go on the website, they are talking about things that go beyond just their own self-interest. Not all of them. Some of them are very transparently self-interested if you read between the leaves, but they are trying to have a conversation about more than just tech. And I think
the immigration policy seemed very self-focused.
Immigration policy, some of the health stuff, quite frankly, on the digital health record seemed a little bit self-interested, but the interprovincial trade stuff didn't. I think trust in institutions more broadly, we've seen is down. I don't know if that's necessarily just because of what corporate Canada has said or done or not done. I think that's because of everything from the cost of living to a younger generation not being able to afford a home, feeling like they are worse off, or their generation will be worse off than their parents. I mean, these are structural things that fundamentally force you to or lean you towards a throw a brick at the glass window moment, right? It's so much bigger than just one of these elements. But that's where I think corporate Canada should speak up more. They should be involved more, and not just when they are forced to testify because their internet went down for a month or a day. There's a lot of work that has to happen, and that's why I'm supportive of people speaking up, whether I agree with their ideas or not.
Right. Do you think there's any sense in the business community that inequality is weakening support for business and even for capitalism, and that there needs to be some reform in that area? I mean, this is the big idea that keeps rattling around in my head, because, if you ask people about capitalism, especially among younger people, support levels are pretty low. Yeah. And I don't really think, the point I was trying to make earlier is I really don't think that many Canadians think we're all in the same boat, or that rising tides even lift all boats.
Yeah.
Right? Do you get any sense that in this community, which is, I think, the exemplar of that, because it seems like Elon Musk could solve our housing problem if he wanted to all by himself. A richer person than when I was growing up, I imagined could exist in the world. Do you think that there's any self-reflection about the role that's playing?
Well, as one of the, it's funny here, sitting here, having to defend or seemingly defend their choices, because I would say that the mainstream media is one of their enemies, right? We are part of the problem in that we are holding them accountable and forcing them to have hard conversations. I'll come to that piece in a second because I think it's a really important piece is why the mainstream media is where it is and how it's viewed. But on the point of them, I've watched a couple of times now. JD Vance was in Paris for the AI summit this week, and I'm not sure if you had a chance to listen to the speech that he gave around AI.
No, I didn't.
It was circulated wildly in the same way that the Argentinian president was circulated wildly about a year ago in Davos, right? The libertarian approach and view, and circulated widely by young men on social media. And so I share that because at the AI Institute thing, when you had and Trudeau, as prime minister, was right there, staring him down with Macron next to him. But JD Vance was talking, while everybody else was talking about safety and guardrails and the risks of AI on children and everything else, JD Vance was talking about, we're going to own the space. The US is going to dominate. We're going to deregulate. If you are in the way, you are part of the problem. We think AI is going to help the world and we're going to make it happen. And the number of cheerleading, the amount of cheerleading on that tells me something. It tells me that there is a frustration with what's seen as big government and regulation. We do polling with Abacus at The Logic on the economic trust regularly. And I was very surprised that regulatory red tape is one of the top issues that people are concerned about across the country. Who would have thought, your world, not mine, David, but who would have thought that such a seemingly, in the weeds type of issue would be something that people are talking about, and productivity. I think there's this feeling of we just got to, quite frankly, tear it all down and break through it. And regulations be damned. Let's just keep plowing through, and then we'll have our opportunity. I would say the tech community is probably more closely aligned with that feeling than some in the business community who have, for various reasons, we don't need to go into them now, had a protected status in this country. When you look at the big banks, the big telcos, the big railways, the big energy companies, for sometimes legitimate reasons. But I think that, I guess what I'm trying to say is there's a difference in the business community itself between, the preservation of Canada as it has been and how do you scale your business across this vast land, and those who think, well, how do you blow it and clear the land so that we can grow and make this country incredibly strong.
Greetings, Canadian Political Pod listener. I'm your narrator, Gary, an artificial intelligence-generated voice. Exciting and serious sounding is what we typed in the AI voiceover input field. And boom, Gary exists. Hey, do you know what's not artificial? Not even one bit? The highly influential audiences air quotes media podcasts offer to its advertisers. And I say that with all the sincerity a machine learning, data-optimized, predictive network of interconnected neural nodes can muster. Whether your ad message is on Curse of Politics, the Herle Burly, Hotel Pacifico, or the brand new Race to Replace, you will be reaching cabinet ministers, members of parliament, the political class, the C-suite, and corporate Canada, leading journalists, and tens of thousands of engaged Canadians. People saying this is a unique political moment is underselling it. Policy is under scrutiny. A party leader is being voted on. The Ontario election is underway. There will be a new prime minister. And then there's the guy living in the White House who calls us the 51st state. Does anyone remember another time like this? I'm instantly scouring millions of data points to answer my own rhetorical question. No, you do not. This is when you need to get your message to the decision makers. Email us at contact@airquotesmedia.com. You'll be dealing with Jill and Todd, who are real, not artificial at all people, and generally very friendly. Well, Jill is anyway. We're still deciding about Todd.
All right, I'm going to stop being such a socialist now, and I'm going to come back, pick up on a point that you made. So this Build Canada thing is largely, if not exclusively, tech entrepreneurs. They've expressed a desire to have other elements of the economy be part of their enterprise, but as a starting proposition, it's largely a tech enterprise. What separates tech entrepreneurs from other entrepreneurs in Canada?
Well, I mean, if I'm going to be cynical for a second, I would say a lot of it is mostly done on websites and software and SaaS, and it's low friction, low overhead. You don't have to. I look at an energy entrepreneur in Medicine Hat or wherever who has to drill down, thousands of meters, and if he's off or she's off by a centimeter, there goes all that money. It's a lot easier to build a website and A/B test it and experiment and see what works, and then pick the winner, and there you go. So I think that is one of the things where I think it maybe looks and seems easier to build when you don't have those long-term investments, risks of payout than it would be, life sciences, for example. You have a 10 or 20-year horizon on building a drug and commercializing that drug. Websites less so. So I would say they do definitely index towards that. What makes them different? I think it's what we've already talked about, which is they feel like they can solve any problem that you put your mind to. But I don't know. I'm maybe meandering here because I feel like it's any entrepreneur has that mindset. You have to be a bit delusional in order to start a company and think that you can.
But there might be something specific about that with tech people, because solving problems. You take something like what Musk is doing with the U.S. government.
Yeah.
It kind of feels to me like he feels he can find the right algorithm and fix the government. Like this is something that is within the grasp of tech to fix everything, to figure everything out. Is there something messianic about this?
So I'm a student of Clay Christensen. I had the great privilege of studying under him and writing a paper with him. And Clay, who's the father of disruption theory, which really became the gospel of Silicon Valley for 20 or 30 years, would argue that, yes, you can disrupt anything. It's cheaper, faster, good enough. If it's cheaper, faster, good enough, you can disrupt any business or any idea or any thought. And I think that is definitely part of the psyche of Silicon Valley. It's been a bit bastardized, I might have you, as someone who actually knows the academic theory of disruption. I don't think that necessarily applies to some of the rhetoric around disruption. It's not about blowing things up. It's about creating new markets and creating new identities and building new structures that are cheaper, faster, good enough. So in some ways, what Musk is doing with Doge, that isn't disruption. That is chaos. That is coming in and completely wiping out what's already there. If he wanted to really disrupt it, he would create a secondary government in a way, like create a whole new bureaucracy with fewer people and find the efficiencies there and then migrate that over. So there is a martyrdom and a grand complex that has emerged out of Silicon Valley. But we created that myth, David. I mean, we all bowed down at the altar of Steve Jobs, and the idea that Mark Zuckerberg could build something in his basement, in his Harvard dorm room. Pop culture celebrated it for a very, very long time, and I would argue right up until the time when the logic was formed, tech was seen as perfect and the model for the future. So, can you fault people for buying into something? I would say, journalistically, because that's the vantage point that I look at it, when we all started covering these companies with a more critical eye, there was a cognitive dissonance in their comms teams and in their C-suites. They didn't know how to react to it because for so many years they had been told that they were the greatest things on earth, and then they very quickly were victimized and became a grievance complex too of, You don't understand us. Mark Andreessen did a podcast a couple of weeks ago that's worth listening to if you haven't heard it, where he basically talked about this grievance politics and why he himself has shifted from being a Democrat to a Republican, and how the Biden administration, in their eyes, made company leaders feel like they were not in control of their own companies. I don't necessarily know if I agree with that, but
what's a for instance?
On DEI, for example, these leaders, who it should be said are mostly all white men, felt like they could not make decisions without their employees rising up against them, and they saw that. I mean, there were protests at Google in the offices or anything else, and they couldn't make decisions. And they felt, even though they are the wealthiest, most successful humans on earth, that they were the aggrieved victim. And I think some of this is grievance politics and revenge, and that feeling of it's not nerds, it's not revenge of the nerds, which is the thing that you've often heard. It's more of we're going to swing this pendulum back. And boy, are they ever.
Back toward what?
Back to where, as you saw this week, Deloitte in Europe, you can't say the word DEI in your communications. Back to where the idea of talking about equality and fairness and labor rights are things that are antithetical to prosperity in business. You've got BlackRock and Larry Fink wiping clean all of his statements over the last decade around DEI. You've got banks in Canada moving away from climate pledges.
So they never believed any of this? They only did it because it was the political zeitgeist of the moment, or the government. They were trying to curry favor with the government of the day. They never believed any of this because they were viewed as, the tech community was viewed as the socially liberal side of the business community.
I don't know what they believed. I do know that the pursuit of profits is a very big motivator or driver if you're in a company. I mean, that is literally your job, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So whether you agree on a personal level when you're making decisions, you have shareholders, you have boards, you have investors, and you're accountable to that.
Right, but let's take something like climate. DEI is a little different. Let's take something like climate. A lot of these companies thought that was, or articulated points of view that was something that needed to be addressed, for everybody's long-term viability. It doesn't really have anything to do with the success of business per se. I guess the question really is, what, in the absence of government regulation, what can we expect out of these kind of companies? I mean, a lot of them are inherent monopolies. Like, you can't really have, I'm on Blue Sky. You can't really, nobody's on Blue Sky. Like, you can't really have two of those things or three of those things. And Facebook is the same, and a lot of these things are the same. They're sort of inherent monopolies. And so when you were more comfortable with the code of the people running them, you were more comfortable with that. When you're less comfortable with the code of I was comfortable with Twitter's existence under Jack Dorsey, and now I'm not comfortable with Twitter's existence under Elon Musk.
Yeah. Well, if in the current moment, if you're asking where this will go in the near term with Donald Trump as president, just watch that J.D. Vance speech from the AI thing in Paris, and I think it gives you a very clear indication of where they will go. Moving away from any sort of what they would call censorship on the internet. I think, if you just look at the incident this week with the Kanye West shirt on Shopify and why it took 24 hours for Shopify to deal with that, it's because they're in the middle of the storm too, and they're trying to react and try to find what's that sweet spot of censorship versus not.
Are we in a world now, really, David, where we have to figure out what the sweet spot is around Nazis and swastikas?
I'm going to get in so much trouble for this because it's not me saying it, but I would say yes. I think we are in a world right now, as you look at the way that companies are dealing with things, where absolutely everyone's afraid of sticking their head out or being seen as a company, being seen as being noticed by Trump. Nobody wants to be noticed by this administration because then you're going to have to manage whatever comes with that. So yes, in this moment, being seen as controlling speech, being seen as controlling what's on your platform is not a place where these companies want to go.
Well, let's talk about that for just a minute, for God's sake. So we've just spent time talking about how these companies feel like government was telling them how to run their business, and they had to have this DEI shit, and they had to care about labor, and government was far too involved, and there's too many rules and regulations. But now they're all totally sucking up to a guy who does the same thing, but not on a rules or legal basis, but on a capricious whim, will damage your business or put you out of business. I mean, he's telling them how to run their companies more than Joe Biden ever dreamed of telling them how to run their companies. And what's their reaction? To give his fucking inauguration $1 million donation. So when I see that, I either think they're hypocrites or they're frankly lean one way more than another. That one kind of interference is more acceptable than another kind of interference.
Yeah, it's a striking time. I mean, it was a striking image at that inauguration to see them all in the front row.
Ahead of the cabinet.
Ahead of the cabinet. Ahead of the cabinet. You have to also understand, though, David, from their perspective, and again, just being clear, this is not my perspective. They have had Section 230 of the U.S. government hanging over their heads. That they've been
Section 230? Don't know what it is.
Section 230 gives them essentially immunity from anything that's said or done on their platforms. So as a news organization, if I publish something that is libelous, I will be sued for libel or defamation, and I will be accountable for that. But if you write a comment on the bottom of YouTube or on Meta or anything or sell a t-shirt on Shopify, they are indemnified because of the protections in Section 230, which say that tech platforms are not media companies, in essence. So for 4 years, they have been marching down this road where Section 230 was going to be taken away, that they were going to lose that immunity. And you can imagine how that would dramatically change their business models because they would be on the hook for everything that's said or done on their platforms. I don't know. JD Vance is interesting because he's kind of spoken on both sides of his mouth on this. He's both anti-big tech, but for smaller, younger startups to be able to rise up and compete. So I don't know where he stands on Section 230, but it is a live issue and has been at the front of their minds for the last 4 years. If they start to moderate their speech, and now I'm speaking as a publisher, in my view, these platforms have always been media companies. I know because I compete with them. And I also see when they manipulate their algorithms to distort speech in a way that we don't as a media company. So that's my own position, disclosing as a journalist / publisher. But I think that they live in fear that Section 230 will be revoked. And so all of these decisions around cozying up to Trump or contradictions on speech are related to that clause to me.
Right. Okay. We got a few minutes left. Let's swing back to Canada and politics in Canada, because what I read about this group in your reporting is that they're not politically aligned. They don't want to be partisan, but they think the Trudeau government sucked. They have high hopes for Poilievre. They've been conversing with Poilievre and Poilievre's people, and they have some reasonable expectation of change. Do you think that there's going to be more political activity from these kinds of elements of the business community going forward? Well,
you've seen this week
might they do more than just have a website?
Yeah, well, this week they wrote a group, some affiliated with Build Canada, some not, wrote a letter calling on Trudeau to bring back the government, to bring it down and get moving. So I think you will start to see, and you're already starting to see, those who are politically active and want to see a Poilievre government will find a different outlet for that than Build Canada. I think they've been very clear, and we have no reason not to believe them, that Build Canada is not a partisan exercise. It's a place for them to articulate their visions for the country and to facilitate conversations that they think people need to have. But that doesn't mean they all feel that way. I think the one thing that's important to recognize or think about is, our reporters will keep working at it, but I'm not sure how closely aligned they are to Poilievre. I'm not sure if Pierre is picking up the phone and talking to them every day. That image of Elon Musk with his kids in the Oval Office this week, I don't know if that's happening in Canada. And so the idea of a Doge Canada and these people sweeping in, it's unclear to me that they have that kind of access to a Poilievre government. Maybe they will, maybe they won't, I don't know. But it's not clear at this point that we should be careful not to draw that direct correlation between what's happening in the US and what's happening in Canada.
Well, I thought it was interesting that Mark Carney's slogan is a complete echo of their name. I mean, he's saying it's time to build. And they say Build Canada. Is there a chance that they have a champion now that's more to their liking than they had before in the Liberal Party?
The people that I've spoken to would suggest not, that there's this feeling of status quo. It's the same government, same ideas, nothing new under the sun. And you've seen them tweet to that effect, some of them. I'm not sure that they're now gravitating towards Carney in that way.
Right. What do you think that they do have to add to? I've been very skeptical, so now I want to ask you a more positive, sort of open-ended question, which is, I've learned a lot about Elon Musk that I don't like over the last number of years. That's just personal. I don't agree with him on a lot of things that he's decided that he has an opinion on. But before I learned any of those things, I thought he was a crazy genius. And I admired him because I thought he was, through business, trying to solve some of the biggest problems we had in the world. So if I'm just to take back the hostility I feel about some of the issues, what do you think a person like him, I don't know there is anybody like him, what do you think he can bring to government? So Donald Trump's brought him into the inside of government and very influential. Where do you think he could really make a positive difference? What does he know? What does he understand that could be positively revolutionary?
So I'm certainly the last person to know the answer to that question. I wonder if it's just the stasis of bureaucracy, right? These founders move fast and break things. That's their MO. It's to come in with fresh eyes and see things differently and say what we want about Elon Musk, whether it was electric vehicles, space, now the brain and neurological things. I mean, the guy does live in a world where he thinks anything is possible if you just put your mind to it. And, generally speaking, when you are in policy making and lawmaking, you are thinking about bad outcomes. You're thinking about the negative externalities, the third order effects, the fourth order effects of policy. If you're doing your job right, I think that's what you're doing. This is a different mindset, right? It's don't worry about the third and fourth order effects. Just get it done, and we'll deal with those when they come up. Move fast and break things. The question isn't what will they do to me? It's, are we at a point in society, or are we at a point in our system where that's needed? Is the government apparatus broken, or is it working? And it's not for me to decide that, but I think that is the question, right? Is what you believe determines what kind of anecdote you need to that. And Americans have decided, based on their voting, that they think it's broken. And so they are doing what they do. Canadians, in a couple of weeks or months, will have to face the same decision, and we'll see what they say.
All right, let's end on that note. Thanks so much for your time, David. This was a fascinating conversation.
Thanks, David. I think there's a whole other conversation to be had around the media and its place in all of this, and I'd love to have that conversation in the future, because what often is unsaid in a lot of what you hear from the tech community is this dismissiveness or rejection of the mainstream media. And one of the things that we're doing on a daily basis is trying to buck that trend and to make sure that the civic discourse and the hard conversations are happening in this country, and giving people like these tech leaders the opportunity to have those conversations.
That's why I admire you so much, and I'm so grateful for what you've done, because it's absolutely the case that the demise of common ground on facts, information, understanding of what's going on is corroding everything in our society right now. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
Thanks a lot. Cool. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN Rail. All you Herle Burly-ites who listened or watched this show today on the YouTube machine, and obviously David Skok for both giving us his time here today and for his work in creating the logic. And I'm off to subscribe right now. So you can check your database. I'll show up. All right. Thanks. We'll see you next week with more of the Herle Burly. David, thanks for coming on.
Thank you, David.